Hi, my name is Ryan Delisle. My presentation today is going to be on the relations between the French and the Wendat people, and really just how they weren't necessarily how it's normally portrayed in a lot of education about the colonization of the area. So my artifact for this is an example of an indigenous-made cross. Uh, in my report, I use a ciborium, which is a Catholic vessel for holding things like the Eucharist, but for purposes of making one and for purposes of explaining what I want to talk about, I wanted to try to create an example of one of the crosses that would be made that an indigenous convert may have in their longhouse or on their person as a rosary. In this case, the cross is a symbol of the Catholic indigenous relations, not just religiously, but also as a broader sense of the two cultures interacting with each other. As I mentioned, it might sometimes be worn as a crucifix, or it might be worn as a rosary, or hung in the house of a believer. Uh, but it was just to show that the relationships between the two were not always entirely hostile, and were not always entirely trade based either. That there was relations that ended up being formed on many other bases that were not violent. So, before I continue my presentation, we do need to kind of set up some context, which we all kind of know at this moment. So I'll go through it somewhat fast. The British were significantly less kind than the French were to the indigenous peoples. It wasn't that they were specifically mean and hostile. That was more the Americans, but we'll get into that in a moment. But they were very. It was a very clear-cut distinction. Indigenous peoples were indigenous, the British were British. You really didn't mix them. The two kind of stayed apart, except possibly for trading, and that was really it. The British didn't really reciprocate. There wasn't really any gift giving after the first few settlements. The indigenous kind of understood that the British traded. They didn't really do gift giving, and it became a somewhat transactional relationship. The Americans were even worse than the British. For the Americans, the main appeal of North America was land. It was not the indigenous peoples there, it was not the resources, it was the idea of having land and having a place to call your own to an extent. So they pushed a lot of the First Nations people out of their land out and to take it over. They really didn't care too much for the indigenous people. The land was the goal. It was that desire for expansion in an extent over monetary benefit. While the British did trade, and they did desire to be in the fur trade to an extent, for a lot of the American settlers, it was the desire to have land and to have something of their own that drove them to settle. And as I mentioned, the indigenous people kind of understood, learned how to interact with the British in those first few years. They understood that there really wasn't much gift giving, and that even when these settlements were doing poorly, it was a more trade relation than anything. The French had a different experience with the indigenous peoples. Despite the performance of the first few settlements, like the British, the French started to understand the indigenous cultures and also kind of helped start that reciprocative gift giving, the idea of actually trading, and tried to become friends with the indigenous to an extent. Uh, More accurately, would probably be to say that just the relationship was more respectful between the two. And now, sure, one could argue that this was for the economic benefit, that the indigenous peoples had control over the fur trade, but that but the French wanted to get into that. So the French figured it would be cheaper to interact with these indigenous peoples kindly and build a friendship, and it would be more beneficial to do that in terms of getting into the fur trade than it would be to fight them to try to take control over it. Now, how do the religious relations between the Jesuit missionaries and the uh, indigenous peoples of French North America, how does that help model this relationship? To be clear, I want to stress that this is during the early periods, closer to pre 1640s ish, is what I'm mainly talking about here. While the Jesuits are still kind of in control of the mission movement in North America. The Jesuits very much kind of embodied this indigenous idea of, not the indigenous idea, the French idea of the relationship with the indigenous. The Jesuits practiced something what they called the gentle way, and it kind of was made of two major parts. The first being that they did not believe in forced conversions, a conversion that was not a completely willingly done conversion to them. To most Jesuits, obviously there's going to be discrepancies in every group, but to most Jesuits was not a conversion. A conversion had to be done fully willingly, or else it was not a true conversion. Another aspect of the gentle way was that there was an acceptance of things that did not directly go against the Catholic teachings. Now, obviously, if the indigenous taught, and this is a complete example, if the indigenous taught that the Jesuits were wrong with everything, obviously they'd go against that. But for things that did not directly go against the Catholic teaching, they could be accepting of it to an extent. And it helped build that relationship between the two. The two could interact with each other's festivals and celebrate each other's cultures to an extent without risking their idea without risking the ideas of others and being seen almost as traitors to their group. They also didn't segregate converts from non-converts. The Jesuits tended, in North America at least, to build churches and chapels closer to indigenous villages, so that way indigenous members could live with their tribes but still attend to their faith. And the Jesuits were not completely keeping themselves away from indigenous villages as well. A lot of them would act as healers inside the indigenous villages to an extent. The French believed that healing was not only a physical practice but a spiritual practice as well, and therefore during this period a lot of priests and religious men had some knowledge of healing, or well, what in that time period would be known as healing. Again, they were still there to convert the indigenous peoples. We're not saying that they weren't there for that. But despite the fact that they were there to convert them, and that they were willing to do it in a way that was less intrusive, in a way that was less combative than in other places where conversions may have been forced, or where things may have not gone as nicely, the fact that the Jesuits were willing to take a more kind and charismatic step to it kind of exemplifies the relations the French had. And that's why we should care about this. In a lot of media, the colonization of North America is usually seen as a very horrible thing. And to an extent, they're correct. In the later half, it was very bad. The English and the British and the Americans' interactions with their indigenous groups were not great at all. But I believe without looking at both the good aspects with the bad, we don't really get a fully realized understanding of what the colonization of the area was. The fact that it wasn't just basically a constant battle. The fact that Europeans and indigenous, more specifically French indigenous peoples, did get along and actually worked with each other, I feel is a idea that is glossed over, or was at least glossed over in my education of the colonization when I was in grade school and middle school. And I feel it's glossed over in a lot of education because we need to understand that there were a lot of bad things that happened. But I believe by looking at the bad with the good, we can get a better understanding of what life really was like for these indigenous peoples and for the French that lived with them.